Let me pull up the chat on the side. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our panel, Components Building the Building Blocks. We're going to give folks like a minute or two to join the webinar. But in the meantime, if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat, please do and share where you're joining us from. We would love to see where you all are coming from. Just make sure on the Zoom chat that you change the to portion from host and panelists, which is kind of the default setting, to everyone when you do so. Ooh, 2 folks from Berlin, or from Germany, 1 from Berlin, another from Berlin, London, a very strong European presence. Spain, Athens, that sounds sunny and I'm a little jealous. Finland, India, LA, Belgium. Oh, just a quick reminder, if you are sending a chat, make sure you change it to everyone instead of to host and panelists. Hi, Victor. There's Wisconsin, the Bay, Czech Republic, Ohio, more Germany, Canada, Colombia. It's always fun to see how global these webinars can be because we do everything virtually now. Knoxville, Moldova. Cool. Well, it's so great to meet you all. It looks like it's 3 minutes past the hour, so I'm going to get started. But so great to see so many folks joining us from around the world. I'm Jocelyn, the head of community at Supernova. And Supernova is a design system platform where you can connect all your data sources, create customized documentation, and automate code delivery to scale your design system. We recently had a product launch, so if you missed it really quickly, we just launched support for Figma variables and also launched a new developer experience. You can check out our website to learn more, but we are all here today for components. So before we dive into the panel, we're also conducting research about components. So if you want to scan the QR code and share how you're currently using components, we would really appreciate that. And all the insights will be shared on our website and directly with folks who submit their email addresses. Before we get to introductions, I do have a few housekeeping items. So the webinar, as you can see, is currently recorded, and we'll share it with you and all the other registrants via email, either later this week or at the top of next week. You can also enable automated captions on Zoom if that's helpful for you. And as I mentioned, you can talk to folks in the chat by changing the to everyone instead of hosts and panelists. And if you have questions for our panelists, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom. Please do make sure you share your questions in the Q&A because we might miss it in the chat. And you all are muted right now. I don't think you'll be able to speak, but you can use the chat or use the Q&A. We cannot hear you, so you are good to go. So today we are joined by an incredible lineup of design system experts to talk about all things components. We'll be chatting about the lifecycle of components from creation to maintenance to deprecation, and also kind of diving into how developers versus designers might approach components. So let's get started with a quick round of introductions. Panelists, if you could share a little bit about yourself, including your name, your pronouns, where you currently work, and then also how long you've been working in design systems. Alissa, if you want to start, and then we can just go in alphabetical order or the order in which your photos show up on the screen, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So I'm Alissa Engstrom. I'm currently the lead product designer at Apollo.io. My pronouns are she, her. And I have been working in design systems for about 3 years, but about 15 years overall in product design.
All right. My name is Dmitry. I'm based in Amsterdam. I'm working at Booking.com as a principal front-end engineer. I joined the company around 6 years ago, and all this time I have been in the same team building design systems, and we grew from 4 people to around 20 people now. And before that, I was also doing front-end development and UI development for about 12 years, I think.
Hi, so I'm Giles. I'm really happy and excited to be here. Thanks for the invite. I'm Director of Product Design at Skyscanner. I've been working at Skyscanner about 3.5 years, and pretty much all of that time been focused on our design system called Backpack and like leading the work to develop Backpack. And I've sort of I can't say I've been working explicitly or only in design systems, but I did, also work on another design system for Canon, who had a cloud photography platform that I worked on a few years ago. So sort of like maybe something like 6 years having that sort of focus, but kind of also feel humbled to be considered an expert. So hopefully I can answer your questions.
You all will do fantastic. So let's get into the questions. To kick things off, what are some key principles and best practices that you all keep in mind when designing and developing components for a design system?
I could start, I guess. I could kick us
Go first.
off. So from a design standpoint, something that I always like to think about when creating a new component is less is more. So try not to add too many elements at first. Restrict yourself. It's easy to get carried away and add, a lot of elements and functionality into a component. But the problem is that when you start to, oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought. If you start to add too many elements into the component, it can become really bloated, and then it's really hard to get out of the system. So it's easier to start small and add more later, rather than adding a bunch of elements at the beginning and then having to weed through them and remove them. And also, I would say that always make sure to use like your variables in your components to keep them consistent, like really limit one-offs, and also like border radius, things like that in your components. Keep those to a minimum. Like we have only 4 border radius that we use throughout our whole system. And that helps kind of keep the design consistent overall.
I also,
Sorry, Dmitry, you
yeah.
go first.
I would also, I have a comment around this, probably kind of similar thing, but from a different angle. So, because in our case, we are like a team of 20, we support a lot of different teams. Obviously, we don't have time to, support every single use case. Sometimes it's on the teams to implement some. So I think the first rule we kind of implemented for our team when we started scaling from a very small team serving just one product to, team serving everyone in the company was that we only build what's requested by other teams. So we don't try to invent the problems ourselves. Even though we might know, something that might happen in the future, but we only try to optimize for what's happening in the product today. And that way we can save some time. The other approach I've been following myself in general is I try to look at every component as a small application. So that way, when we're building the component, we're basically setting the rules that we own everything that happens inside of the component, but then it can be used anywhere. So the same way as, if you think of the page as like a place where multiple applications are inserted, all those applications don't know about each other. The same way component doesn't know what happens outside of its implementation. So that way you can be sure that whatever you build inside the component, you have full control over. You may change it as the development goes or the design goes, so you can be sure about that. But then you also start thinking about what's exposed to others. What are the entry points to the design system? Because that's where like every change becomes critical, and those parts of the components need more time to make the right decisions to make sure that it will work for the next year, for the next 2 years without breaking the product.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that resonated for me in both your answers, actually. I mean, I think the less is more thing, I can really identify with that. And I'd sort of framed it slightly differently, and it is a sort of, there's a different angle to that, which is I'm quite, one principle I follow is that we try and minimize redundancy as much as possible. So it's not just about kind of not adding too much stuff, but also we're starting, I came into Skyscanner when there was already a design system in place. A lot of the focus has been about how to kind of like remove elements where they overlap already with, they're already doing the same job as some other components. So we're kind of really focused on minimizing redundancy, and that's one principle I like to follow. I also like, Dmitry, exactly what you said. This is something I've been thinking about, because when we approaching this panel, but that idea of like, we do try and focus on what people want and needs that exist in our product, and that's where the components come from in terms of this as a starting point. But the second principle is around being opinionated. And I don't know whether this applies to all design systems, but for our design system, we like to be opinionated. What is a component should have a distinct role, and we want to be clear about what that is, and we want to be clear about when it should be used and when it shouldn't be used. Around having good reasons for sort of diverging a component across platforms, because we support iOS, Android, and web, so we need to kind of have components that work on all of those platforms, and we trying to keep them as similar as possible, unless there's like a really clear reason to diversion, like a sort of common pattern on those devices that we want to follow, or some kind of native feature that we want to make use of. But like, importantly, that's sort of, you can only be opinionated if you're also like open to having a debate about things, so, because the aim of the design system, and this is like design systems as a whole, but it applies to components too, is that idea that you try and build consensus, and like the design system reflects a set of decisions effectively that are made kind of in a collective manner. So like we say, this is what we think, but it's a thing that it's a shared philosophy, and if someone doesn't agree with it, we're open to hear that, and we're really open to changing stuff as well and making it better. But I think if you're not opinionated, you miss that debate altogether. So that's another thing. And then I guess the last principle is around really thinking about the consumer experience and kind of prioritizing that. So that's kind of like, what's it like for the designer to use this component, or the developer to use that component? And that's sort of like a kind of principle that we kind of always have in the back of our minds when we're designing the components and thinking about how they come into the world, effectively.
Yeah, we kind of do the same thing too, like with building the components, making sure that how we're building them is consistent, like naming wise, so that our designers using the components are, they're our user too, so they're getting used to a pattern of like, oh, this Boolean's always going to be labeled this way, and it's always going to have, it's always going to function this way in every component and whatnot. So it's a good call out.
So you all mentioned a little bit about like new components, or that process to add it, and then also with the principle in mind of limiting redundancy and less is more. How do you decide when to add a new component? When is the right time? What does that decision-making process look like?
So it can be, I think, in our case, because we are around like 6 years down the road, we are at the stage where we almost don't add new components. But we kind of structured the design system that way that our team only owns the core part of the system of the UI, which can be reused across the products. And we do have product teams who are building their own UI components on top of the design system. So most of the new components get added by the product design teams, and they actually have more freedom that way, because they know what their product needs, they can experiment with those components, and they can, iterate much faster than we can at the central team. But still, like, if it goes to the new component, I think it kind of correlates to one of the principles that we usually expect the teams to create requests for us. So at this point, we rarely just go to the product ourselves and say, well, we see you are struggling with this, so we'll go it away from you. We might highlight this, but we would expect the team to reach out to us, because that also highlights the commitment from the team to then adopt the component.
Yeah, I'd
So
say at Apollo, like, oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, that completely resonated. I mean, we've had that situation in the past where we've kind of actually said, hey, I think you guys are going to need this. So we put a lot of effort into building out component, and then the adoption wasn't great. And that, that's not to say that the team doesn't need that, but without that adoption, it suggests the priority isn't right, basically. So we're similar. Like, I think when our design system might not be as mature, so we are still adding things. But even if you think of like making changes as well, it's the same thing as that. We look for a request from someone within the product design team, because that suggests, that reflects a real need in the product, and we know, we want to. Backpacks were actually open source, so anyone can use it, but it's there to sort of for Skyscanner to build UI for our travelers. So that's the kind of main focus, and that's what would trigger a kind of a component being added to the system. Also, we rely on contributions heavily. So again, like, change happens because other teams are willing to do a lot of the legwork and then contribute that into the system. So the kind of things go hand in hand.
Yeah, we're in a probably completely different state than you all. We're still building our design system, and this is really our first comprehensive design system at Apollo. So we're very much in like the iterating state, trying to figure out what we need and everything. So our process is a little different. We've been doing a lot of different jam sessions with our feature squads to try and figure out what we need, what will work across the product and be useful across the product. So those have been really nice to have at the beginning of like starting a new design system. But we do have a more formal process as well for adding new components to the system. And so we do have things like a dedicated Slack channel where we can have conversations about, components, how to use them, whether a new one should be added. And then we're a big Notion company, so we have like a Notion document with a database with a formal form that folks can fill out, like if we need this component, and then we can chat about like whether it will be added to the system or not.
Awesome. Oh, sorry, Dmitry, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I was just about to mention also, I think the part about contribution resonates with me a lot, especially like not just well, it does help with the part of the adoption because the team does their part of the work, but also in a sense that a lot of requests that come from the product teams, they usually have something in mind already around like how components should look and how it should work for them. So what we've started doing at some point is also, we started doing it internally in the team, but also kind of dragged everyone with us through the process, where if someone wants to create a component or add a new feature to the component, we have a design proposal template for them. So that's where in Figma, they would actually design it themselves outside the library. And they would, try it in different product scenarios. At that point, they'll know that they're designing component for the design system and not just for their product. So they're ready to, go one extra mile and, do the documentation or contribute to some parts of the process. But it also means that sometimes teams wouldn't just, suggest components to us. They would actually tell us, we build a custom component ourselves. it's already in the product, we've tested it, and it works great. We think it's the time to contribute it back to the system now, because that's where we are sure and we're informed about the data that's coming from the product that this component actually works, for a number of metrics that we care about.
Do you have a kind of issue there around where someone's like, it's tried and tested and ready to go and we want to contribute it, but you're like looking at it going, we also have our own standards for our design system, and what you've built doesn't meet those standards, and then, what's the appetite that team feels like their job is done, so they kind of don't actually maybe want to make any changes to bring it to standard, and then, you end up stuck. I wonder how you deal with that bit. I know it's something that we struggle with.
Yeah, I think in general it's about like how you handle contributions from the product teams. So the kind of the story we tell to the product teams is that if you have time or you want to contribute to the system, you're free to do this. We are supporting you with, we're guiding you, we're telling you about the process, about the expectations. We still acknowledge that, they have their teams, product teams have their product work to do as well. So if they're dropping the ball at some point, we're there to pick it up. So, and pick it up usually might mean two things. They might have dropped the ball because it's no longer relevant or important. And that's where we'll just say, well, we'll park it for now. We'll keep it in the archive in case someone wants to get back to this. Or if it's still relevant, but the team just didn't have time, but we maybe hear from other teams that they have a similar request, that's where we will actually finish the work for them. It doesn't mean that, this is the rule. It's more like an exception to the process, but we try to make sure that we're extracting as much value of other people's contribution as possible.
That makes sense. Continuing on the train of creating components, this is also like an audience question, is like, how do you balance creating components that are both flexible and strict and consistent? And does that vary from a design to development perspective?
I mean,
I can talk about design.
I was gonna say, you could go, Alissa. I'd love to hear.
We have some components in the system that are more strict than others. So typically, like, let's just a button, like it's always going to function the same way. But then we'll have other components like cards that are a little bit more ambiguous and might have, different kinds of content within them. So, but we'd still want to like maintain consistency throughout those components as well, while still being flexible. So one of the things that we do is we actually allow like the content portion of the card to be more of like a slot component, where the teams can add, whatever elements that they need within the card, but then we'll have more strict rules around what they can put in like their card header or their card footer, like how those function. So our card headers are like popover headers, modal headers will be consistent throughout the product as far as like the placement of header text and things like icons and where the badge is placed. Like the badge is always placed after the header text. So that'll be consistent throughout the whole system, but then still allowing that flexibility in the content portion.
I think for us, like, I think I can, relate myself to both camps here in terms of like flexible and unflexible design system, because what we're trying to do is we actually like the mission of our team, if you say so, it's to help teams build interfaces that are distinct booking.com. So we want to make sure that whatever they're building, it correlates with our brand. So we have to sometimes be more opinionated about what components can do and what not. At the same time, when we started, 6 years ago, we were quite opinionated about the components and their composition because we were mainly supporting just one product. And now we are supporting multiple customer-facing verticals. We're supporting internal tools, partner-facing tools, etc. So over the last few years, we actually extracted all of those opinions into the product components and kept just the core, very core part of it. But I think the very kind of the lesson I learned myself is that whenever you are building this opinionated design system with, that always follows the brand guidelines, always follows the design language, etc., you are basically saying, if you use our components, you will be, matching the brand 100% of the time. And that's what we want to achieve with the design system. And they put it as their North Star. What happens then is teams come to you and say, well, we have this new product where we need slightly different placement of some elements or add a new thing here. But because the system is already opinionated, it either means they are blocked until it's embedded into the system again, or they detach your component. And doesn't mean just in design, can also be in development. They just create custom thing, which means that over time it will actually diverge from the system and like its evolution. So let's say you are no longer at 100% you were trying to get to, you are now at 60%. While if you would have sacrificed that quality within the team and you would say, our goal is 80%, but we achieve that by increasing the flexibility of the system, that in reality will give you better alignment with the brand and everything, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of, as I say, like, obviously we're leaning towards what the current needs are in the product. So like in terms of flexibility, I think there can be a temptation to sort of think too far into the future. And often all that does is create choice that isn't really needed and actually can cause, inconsistency in the product. And that's obviously one of the aims of, it's not the only aim of the design system, but it's one of the aims is to kind of make the product experience consistent and coherent. So, in a sense, we don't provide options unless they are, there's something driving that need, basically. And if we think of a component and there's different scales of how, like, what superpowers it has, it's often better just to focus on the current need, because we can always change it later. We can always enhance it or add something for it later. But one of the sort of tricks that we have is to be keeping in mind what we consider to be sort of families of things or similar things, and in our design files keep those things close together. So like we have we have a sort of single library for the core of Backpack, which is our design system, and that's our kind of core UI. And within that, each component has its own page. So that kind of already specs things out. But what we might do is go, hey, these kind of things all are similar. So let's put an instance of each one of those things, in a sticker sheet somewhere so we can kind of see them together. And that kind of like, then you begin to see the relationship between things and the extent to which something might need more flexibility or less flexibility and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think something also I kind of remember from what you just said is that what we try, maybe you can really include that in one of the principles, is even though we're doing everything based on requests we receive from the team, we still are experts in the domain, so we kind of can anticipate some of the needs in the future. It doesn't mean that we implement them immediately, but at least we keep the door open for those changes in the future. So that's like one of the key aspects we're thinking about when we're making the changes.
Yeah, I mean, similar to that as well, is like often a request will come from one team, but we kind of instinctively know that another team is going to need that component but have slightly different needs. And that's, so we're trying to kind of, particularly when the contribution is coming from one team, one of our jobs is to go, we really appreciate your contribution, but can you also add some additional requirements because we know they're needed elsewhere. And so one of the hard bits of our job is to actually have that view of the whole product and try and think about all of these different activities that are going on across the business that keep an eye on that. and we've got kind of agents on the ground to do that. So we've got a kind of system of advocates who advocate for the design system, but sit in design teams, and they're kind of like kind of go-between, and we get them to come up, we meet with them regularly, and they talk about what they're doing in their area and stuff like that. And that builds up that sort of intelligence that we need to understand, you know, where we might want to add some flexibility to something that the person who's put their hand up first, say we need this, doesn't see.
And does the same happen for you when, for example, someone from the web team of the product creates a request and they are willing to contribute, but then you have to implement it on other platforms? What do you do then?
You start to cry at that point. No, it's very hard. That's a very hard thing to deal with. We've sort of got a principle, obviously, that, you know, the design system ought to be, you know, we deploy equally across all platforms, but in practice we may not always be able to do that. So it's a difficult thing. But the thing that we try and do is we try and anticipate this request at the earliest point. So we look at the whole sort of delivery process, the end-to-end delivery process, from discovery all the way through to like shipping. And we've got a diagram of that process, and kind of we explain, we've got the contribution process starts pretty early. And we'd say to people, like, you know, as soon as you're kind of developing concepts, just reach out to us. And we've got, I think Alissa said this earlier about Slack channel. So there's a Slack channel where this kind of conversations can happen. And so that's like people going, hey, I'm thinking about this. And, you know, immediately we see that interest in something, then we will try and track it. And we kind of do that in, you know, we just put a ticket into Jira and we can track that stuff. And what will happen is we'll go, okay, so that looks like it's incoming. Who's actually contributing that? What platforms are they responsible for? And if they're only delivering on web, we'll immediately try and reach out to allies elsewhere and go, hey, they're doing this, but we think we need to kind of get a contribution for another platform, and would you be willing to do that? And we kind of try and beg people to put it onto their roadmap. But I mean, Skyscanner to an extent tries to deliver more or less, you know, on all platforms all at the same time. So we kind of effectively suffer the same problems that all product teams do as well. You know, so if they're not releasing a new feature across all platforms, then that might impact us too. But if they are, we get the benefit of that. So, but it is a difficult thing.
So one thing I heard you all mention a little bit earlier is like the different pages in which you're explaining the components, so documentation and reference sites. How do you all document those components? And I think the other piece of it is who's doing it, especially since you all are getting a bunch of contributions. Does the weight to document them fall back on the central design system team or on the folks contributing it? And then I'm also curious, one of the questions that came up in the documentation panel we did is, do your design and developer documentations for components live in the same place? So that kind of covered a lot with components and documentation, but would love to dive a little bit more into that.
I can sort of start on this one. Well, all of our documentation lives on Supernova, which we love. That's why we love Supernova. And one of the reasons we chose it was we needed a tool that we could easily create that documentation, and a lot of the need of the documentation is to be able to sort of, you know, draw a picture of your component and get it into the documentation site. Because we're designing in Figma, it's great to be able to not have to sort of export loads of designs and then import them somewhere else and keep them in sync. But as a need, we also, like, at the time, all of the documentation lived on, the developers create their documentation in GitHub. So we needed to be able to pull that in, and we're able to do that. So Supernova is like the place where you can see everything together and all of that context. I mean, but developers can also develop the same content directly in GitHub if they're in GitHub looking at the repository. So that's really a real benefit, and not having things distributed in lots of different places. How we do it, we've got a clear idea about what the sort of structure of a component documentation page ought to look like. So, you know, there's we typically will have an overview. That's where we talk about the sort of purpose of the component, its anatomy, what variants exist, you know, states and properties and things like that. And then we would aim to have a usage, a sort of a tab that covers the usage and explains how to use that component. It's bit more designer focused. But as I say, all of the developer documentation's there, so there'll be tabs for each of the different platforms that show both the kind of the implementation. So we've all say for the apps, there's an automation that will generate screenshots of components and then insert them into the documentation. Plus the sort of the property tables and API type stuff that comes in from GitHub. So that's all there in one place. We're lucky to have a sort of dedicated content designer. So he's been able to write a kind of how to write good documentation and sort of, you know, establish that. So because and we kind of, I think it's a hard thing for designers who are contributing to also write documentation. So a lot of it ends up coming back to us, but we want to kind of democratize that as much as we can. So there's kind of like this sort of how-to guide for at least getting us started with it. And the developer's responsible there for their documentation too. What we do in terms of keeping things together as well is to have in our libraries, when we're defining the component API, mostly that sort of exists as a sort of table of properties. So we create there's a little table widget that you can drop into Figma, and then we actually write down fill out what the component API table, all of that data goes into Figma. So it's there next to the design, and that allows designers and developers to have a conversation and make changes to property names and things and keep it all together. That table then ends up being reproduced as a sort of table in developer documentation, but we try and keep that sort of those things close together.
Yeah, this is a little bit awkward since this is a Supernova panel, but our team uses zero height.
You're fine.
So we're a little bit scrappy. We only have 2 designers on the team right now and a small handful of engineers. So we're mostly documenting in zero height. As I mentioned before, at Apollo, we use a lot of Notion. So I have to make sure to link back, you know, from Notion to zero height. As well as I make sure that, you know, we're having our documentation links within our Slack channels as well, which we utilize a lot as like pinned links up at the top. As far as like our engineering team, we use Storybook as well. So those are all embedded and linked in zero height as well in a different tab, so that can switch back and forth between like our written documentation that we're doing for the actual like design component, and then the engineering implementation side of it as well. Just to get into a little bit more detail about like what we add into our documentation. Right now we have a couple different focus areas. We have our like anatomy that we document. The do's and don'ts I found are like the most important for the design system, because you're going to have to govern it. You're going to have to tell people how to use it. So if you had some strong do's and don'ts in your documentation, that's key. If you skip everything else and just have your do's and don'ts, that's good. And then like accessibility. Another one that I make sure to add in our documentation is like any research that we have regarding the component. So whether it's like outside research that we've looked up or internal research that we've done within the company, having that linked back to the component always helps too. So when you get someone who's asking like, well, why is it functioning this way? Like, can't we just change it? You could be like, well, here's our research behind this particular component. And that's worked out really well in the past. And then in our actual Figma files, we have it linked on the actual component. So like when the designers are pulling the component out of the asset library, they can see the link to the documentation right there. And then as well as in our component file, they're all organized by page, each component by page, with a link to the documentation right there where they can get to it. So I kind of like spam the documentation everywhere in the system. So there's no questions about where to find it.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think that part about the keeping the research in the docs is something we want to try ourselves. We never got to it yet. But that's something we kind of stumbled upon this in the past where you would make a decision, like very simple decisions about things like how do you align text in the buttons, for example, if they, go multi-line or something like that. And it just, it keeps repeating itself where, you align it to the left and then someone creates a request, let's align it to center, and you change it to center and then let's align it to the left. And you just don't remember why the previous decision was made unless you document these things. But I think in terms of the content, I think we mentioned a bunch of things already, which is like, here's the API of the component, the accessibility section, do's and don'ts and guidelines. In terms of how we store our documentation, I think first of all, we use a lot of in-house tooling built in-house. And we kind of, first of all, this disclaimer before I start talking about it is, if you are a small team, you probably don't want to invest in this because it takes a lot of time to build anything in-house. What we are using ourselves is we have two, I think, main documentation layers for us. One is internal. So we have a thing called Design API, and that's the place where we store the schemas of all the components properties. So for example, if we are adding a new property to a button, we'll have it documented in that API. And that's what we use in internal discussions to say, we know how the property is called. Before we started doing that, we had discussions that button should be, should support a red color, for example. And then that was back when we were using Sketch before Figma, even like 5 years ago. And then each platform will go and implement that red button, but everyone will do it in their own way. And in the end, you end up figuring out, well, for someone, turning it red is a Boolean flag, so you can actually use different button variants with it. And for someone, it's actually another variant, and it can be used only with the primary button, for example. So that's something we started doing ourselves all the time. And whenever someone creates a request for a new property or a new component, that's the part which we start our documentation with. And it powers the development on all platforms. And then there is kind of external documentation for the product teams. That's where we use different tools. So we have our design documentation, development documentation on each platform are separate resources, but we cross-link across all of them. So it does feel like it's the same thing in the end. And the reason they are different is also, first of all, we want to store our documentation next to the code because documentation is a part of our definition of done. Whenever we're making any change in the component, documentation is a part of the same merge request or the same change. The second part is like for each platform, we usually need slightly different types of documentation. So for example, for design, you would just explain more of, the design standards of the company, how it aligns with design language, with branding. For developers, it's more about how you would use the component and what code you would actually write, and rendering actual snippets of the component for that specific framework. So just storing all of them in the same place for us means that single platform should support native apps, should support multiple web frameworks, should support Figma embeds, etc. And another factor, like I mentioned, there are other product teams who are building components on top of the design system. So even though they're building components outside of the system, we still try to provide them with the same experience. So we want them to have their components documented the same way, and we don't want them to, invent the tools themselves or adopt different tools. So we're trying to get everyone on the same tool built in-house. And the only thing we're trying to provide on top of that is we automatically try to connect it through a single search. So if, let's say, you have 20 different teams who build their components, no matter which documentation you go to, if you search in it, you will find components from all other teams as well. So it does feel like, it's a single resource where everyone contributes to.
Yeah, it sounds like what I'm hearing is what's the most important thing, regardless of what platforms you have it on or who's writing it, is that it's easy to find, that they're connected, and that everything kind of, maybe it doesn't all live in one spot, but you can access all the different spots all together so that you can see all the different documentation at the same time, whether you're designing or developing, and having that connection between the two is really important.
I mean, I definitely feel it feels good if there's like a single place you can go that's going to have the complete story, and it,
Yeah.
even actually like it's pulling in stuff from different places. I think that's really important. But also, like, the counter side of that is this thing I said at the beginning about thinking about the consumer experience. And like, as Alyssa's kind of saying, like, if a designer's in a design file and they're thinking about something, or they need to know something, they may not be like, right, I'm going to go to the documentation site and I'm going to start from the top and find my way down. They might just be like, what, I'm going to click on this component and go to the library and try and figure it out. So like being able to kind of think about that journey, and then, from that, find your way to where the thing is written down. That's what we sort of do, like leave bits of helpful information as you sort of stumble on it, and also try and like get those links from Figma direct into the Supernova doc site so that it's all kind of joined up. And it's slightly manual processes for us at the moment, like in terms of going, here's the link to this component, having to make sure you remember to put that in the Figma file and stuff like that. So, and our documentation site is not, the documentation is not complete. Like, it's a massive task. We started effectively with an existing design system with loads of components in it, but no documentation, particularly on the design side. So my view is like some documentation is better than no documentation. So even if it's kind of incomplete, it's better that there's something there. And that's like, that's an opportunity for someone to go, I'm looking for this answer and I can't find it, and then they can tell us and we can go, okay, let's try to double down on getting that bit of documentation built out, so they explain that question that they've got. So
For sure. We have about 12 minutes left, so I will ask one final question for you all, and then we can jump into the audience questions. Let's see, where do we begin? Versioning is actually something that I think tends to come up in almost every single panel. So I'm really curious, like, how does your team manage versioning of components, especially for folks who've been doing, the design system has existed for several years? Like, how do you roll out a new version, and what happens when teams are still using previous versions?
So I can start. We are very strict with our versioning, and we kind of, went through a bunch of challenges in the past where we had to make it more strict. We have different types of versions. So first of all, we do major and minor versions to simplify it a bit. So majors are the versions which might include breaking changes. So some things might break in your design and code, and we do them once per year. So every February, we release a new major version, which we prepare before that. And usually when we release it, we also create a proposal. Here is what we are going to build for the next major version that is 1 year ahead. It might not include all the details, but it just, outlines the main topics we're planning to work on, and the things that were the areas where people can expect things changing, and like API of the components changing. We might, deprecate some of the component properties during the year, but it means that for us, because of this major release cycle, we'll support basically the old version and the new version at the same time till the end of the year. So we'll keep the backwards compatibility for the product teams. And when it comes to minor versions, we are basically free to release it, almost every day, every week. There is no limitation, and we're making sure that we're just not breaking anything. We are trying to cover everything with tests. We're trying to make sure, our Figma works as expected. And we also try to do it together for all platforms. We also support like native apps, web, and design. And so whenever we're building a component or a new feature, we're building it together. It doesn't mean that these changes will release on the same day for all the platforms, but we are trying to keep that gap as small as possible. Obviously, there is some platform-specific work that we have to be doing, so developers might be busier on one side, like on app side versus the website, so one of the platform will release it faster. So this gap is fine, but one of the things I think that helps us keep it together is we're doing monthly updates for all the product folks. So they don't have to track our releases every single day on Slack or on all the different channels. For people who are just, don't have this capacity to, keep up with our work all the time, they can just once per month, they can come to our workplace group, in our case, and read all the highlights from the past month and like see what's relevant for them and what's not.
We're not quite to the versioning stage at Apollo since we're still building, but on a previous design system I worked on it, we had a very similar process to Dmitry. Actually, we had like our major updates, which included breaking changes, which we did probably around twice a year. Tried to limit those because they're just very disruptive to the teams, and then we would do minor changes in between that wouldn't break the components. But on the design side, if we're talking about a big breaking change to a component where it completely breaks it in Figma and whatnot, we may deprecate the old component and create a new one. And what we do to deprecate is we will, first of all, I will always communicate with the team, like let them know exactly, like, hey, we're going to be making a major change to this particular component. Just a heads up for you guys so you guys can mentally prepare yourself for this change. And then to make the change and start the deprecation of the old component. So what does that look like? So normally the old component will put like a red background on the component so that the team knows not to pull that out of the asset library, or if they update their files in Figma, they'll notice that like maybe it's a little different looking and they should change it. Like we just had to do that with some of our icons actually at Apollo, where we had to deprecate them and then they had to switch them out. So I put little like red borders around all of our icons that we were going to be deprecating, and then put in our documentation and in our Slack channels that like, here's the ones that you'll use instead, and swap these out. And then I would give them a timeline in which they would need to swap those out before they were completely eliminated from the system.
Yeah, before we started, I was talking about some of the questions being really hard, and I think this is the one. I mean, in terms of like Backpack's code libraries, it's got a similar kind of system of like it's a single release, like the whole. It's not like individual components are not versioned. It's Backpack has a release. It's a kind of major, minor, or patch release, and that release will have a change log saying what's changed, and that might be, so if one component's updated, that would be a release, one release to Backpack. The problem is how do we do versioning in design? And there isn't really a very easy way to do it. So everything is, unless someone here listening has got some stuff to tell me, it feels very kind of workaround and manual processes. So similar to Alissa, we kind of like, our red background is the ghost emoji. So we add ghost emojis to anything that we want to move into our graveyard, and we've got like so we create a set of, there's a parallel library. So we've got our main component library, but we've also got a graveyard library, and then we do the process of moving components from one library to the next when we don't want someone to use that component. It's quite hard. It's not a very well-designed system. If there's anyone from Figma listening, got to do better work because it tends to go wrong all the time, and it's called, you know, all of these grey hairs are mostly to do with that. And you know, even the branching feature doesn't really work for us at all either, because we've got all of our components in one library. We can't branch the library because we're wanting to make changes to individual components. So that doesn't really work. We've tried a system, and we sort of tried a system again where we spin up a dedicated library for that one component. We tell people that we're working on it, and when we move that component into the dedicated library, then we can branch that library. But you can't either publish out a branched component, so you can't sort of try out that component in other people's designs until you've merged it back. So it doesn't really make your life a lot easier. So obviously we try and minimize breaking changes as much as possible. And I think by spending a lot of time making sure that changes don't affect designs, then you build your designers build the confidence that they can accept changes from their you know, from the Figma library without there going to being a problem, because we really want people to not be sitting around with that little kind of toast in the corner of their Figma file saying there's an update here, and they just ignore it because they think it's going to break their designs. So you can only get people to click on that if you've built up the trust of not breaking things. When we publish a component and we know it's a breaking change, we are very clear about that it's a breaking change, and then we kind of are there on hand to help people navigate that. And I think the same as what Alissa said, sometimes you just have to make a new component effectively. And what we want to do is, like, if someone's been working on a feature and they've finished working on that feature, they don't want to come back to that file later on and find it's all completely different and doesn't reflect what they originally did. So, you know, it's better not to, you know, better to have old components floating around that are stable than to sort of like things changing mysteriously. But it's really, really hard work, because if you then take that old design and you want to, you know, you're working on a new feature in the product, all of those components that are the wrong ones have to be swapped. There's no real good way for doing that in Figma either. So it is pretty hard work. And we also in a situation where, like on web in particular, Skyscanner is actually a set of microsites, and we can't necessarily guarantee that all of those microsites are running the same version of Backpack. So we can only in design manage one version of Backpack. So that means that you could be designing with a component that won't look the same when it gets released in the product, because that product area is behind a Backpack release. So it's really, really hard work. But we try and sort of sync the Figma and code releases as well. So that thing about having a small gap relates as well to, you know, when do we publish the update in the Figma library versus when Backpack code is published. We try and keep that window quite small so that things stay in sync. But it means that we can sometimes have a bunch of changes like hanging around. Sometimes they get accidentally published, because, you know, so this is an area for the next config. I'm looking forward to it, because it's really we need more support at the design tool side for this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it sounds like there's definitely a lot of things to think through when it comes to versioning, and just things changing on design and code, different components or patterns, and just like a lot of moving pieces, which makes sense because there's huge products, and when one thing changes, it could potentially break other things, or just be difficult to find changes. We are at time right now, so I won't go into audience questions, but before we started the panel, our panelists did agree to help us answer any of the remaining Q&A questions via a follow-up blog post. So we'll get answers out for your questions via text instead, out of respect for everybody's time. But thank you all so much for joining us. I've learned so much about components and all like the nitty-gritty of components. So really appreciate y'all and the perspective that you all shared.
Great. Thank you for
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a good rest of your day and good night.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.